Hi, this is Mary Hood, sometimes known as the Relaxed Homeschooler. I'm going live today to talk on Facebook about a topic that a number of people have asked me about recently, which is basically teaching foreign language to students in the homeschool setting. However, this really is appropriate not only for homeschoolers, but for anybody who wants to help their students learn a foreign language, whether it's in the elementary school or later on in high school. The first thing, of course, is to ask yourself with anything, any subject at all, especially in homeschool setting, is why am I teaching it? And of course, foreign language is not always necessarily required, depending on your state law, until possibly you get to the high school years, and then probably only a couple years of it. So you need to ask first, why is it important to teach? Or is it important for you to teach a foreign language? I have personally found that working on a foreign language seems to exercise a part of my brain that is not exercised by anything else. As an older person, of course, I always want to be concerned about the possibility of me getting a little mushy with my brain. And I find that when I'm working on a foreign language, it helps me both to make certain connections and to work on my memory skills and so forth. And I've got to believe that the same thing happens with young children. Recently, I was at the public library. One of the reasons people ask me to talk about this subject is they know that I'm about to teach a class of Spanish this fall. And so I was at the library looking for some Spanish materials, and I happened to see an Italian set. It's the Pimsleur language series, which I like a lot, especially for teenagers and adults. And so I looked at it and I said, just on a whim, I took that out and I said, maybe I'll play with this for a little while. And I started listening to these language tapes in the car. And it's really fascinating to me, especially making various connections between Spanish and Latin and French and even German to some extent. How many things are the same about Spanish and Italian, and in what ways they're different. And it seems to be almost an in-between language, in between Latin and Spanish. I'm not a big Latin scholar. I can speak to some extent all those other languages, but I really have never studied Latin as a specific subject. But at any rate, so to me, number one, like I said, it exercises your brain and just helps you make certain connections and helps in your overall communication skills when you work with children, even when they're quite young, in a foreign language. But in addition to that, I think it expands your consciousness, if you will, of other places, the other people's, just to know that a particular thing like this has more than one word, that can express it. To me, all of those things are fascinating for young children. If you are a bilingual family, by all means, be sure your kids are brought up speaking both, if at all possible, or at least having some familiarity with them. When I was a child, we weren't exactly bilingual, but my parents were of German descent. And I noticed that my dad never spoke German, even though I knew he had quite a bit of it in him. But my mother spoke a fair amount of German, mostly in the way of just little sayings, like viele Hände machen schnell ein Ende. That means basically many hands make light the work. She would always come up with little sayings like that, and we were always saying good night and good morning and in German, and then we would be doing something at Christmas time. We'd be singing all the Christmas carols and so forth, and talking about the Tannenbaum, the Christmas tree. So, and as a result of all that, I'm not fluent in German by a long shot, but the little bit of German that I do know is very much a part of me. And when I wanted to go to Germany, one thing I like to do is, if I'm planning to go into another country, which I haven't done a lot of, I intend to do more of it as I get older, but when I go to another country, I like to study the language for about 6 months in advance so that I at least have a little bit of familiarity with it. And so I studied German for about 6 months before I went over there. And again, in 6 months, you certainly don't get fluent, but again, there's so much of me that it's just, what I do know is it's a part of me. It seems so natural, if you will. So I went over to Germany, and everybody said, oh, you really don't need to do that anyway, because everybody will be speaking English. Well, I went, first of all, to Munich, known as München in German. I went to Munich first, and there it was a very touristy town. And yes, I found lots of people who speak English. But then I left from there. I went on a train over to Stuttgart, and then I rented a car, and I drove around in the Black Forest region of Germany on the Autobahn. That was fun. But I did all that, and After I left Munich, I was there for roughly a week after that, and I never again ran into anybody who spoke English. And yet, I have all these memories of having conversations, of talking to the people as I'm checking into hotels. I even sat on a park bench with an old German grandfather and spoke nothing but German to him for about a half an hour. And we understood each other. Again, I'm not saying I'm fluent, but we understood each other. It was a powerful experience to me. This is a man who actually was around in Germany during World War II. And my own family is from there. I got very emotional as I was coming down on the plane into Germany because I was the first person who'd been able to go back after all those years. My ancestors left in about 1870, and after that there was always some kind of war going on that nobody could go back. And other than one male cousin who went back, who was in the army for a little while, stationed in Germany, I don't believe anybody else from my family had ever gone back. And it was emotional for me. I found myself seeing myself and my relatives in other people's eyes. They looked like me, the big German woman, and all that. It was a very empowering and powerful experience for me. So I'm just saying that to say that the language can be a part of expanding your knowledge of other cultures and also getting back into your own culture. I really enjoy watching those TV shows where they're tracing back. It's on PBS, I forget the name of it, but they're tracing back people's lineages and learning about their ancestors. So I'm really into both learning about your own roots and finding your roots. That's the name of it, with Henry somebody. I'm really into learning about my own roots more and experiencing that partly through language. When I speak, when I go down to the beach, for example, there's a certain poem that I know in German that I say, and when I say that, one day it occurred to me that it's a way of connecting with my grandmother, who only spoke German. She didn't ever know any English, all right? And I never met her because she died long before I was born. And yet, when I was speaking German, when I was saying that poem and standing there, it had to do with God's greatness. And I was just really feeling connected to her for a few minutes. So at any rate, I think there's a lot of reasons for learning foreign languages. Now, when you're talking about high schoolers, sometimes people aren't doing it so much because they want to learn a foreign language, as because they need to get a couple of credits on their transcript. Now, if that's the reason, if it's the only reason you're doing it, at that point in my video just went off, but I think yours is still on, so I'm going to keep on going and hope you're not just looking at something black on the screen right now. At any rate, so if you're doing it in high school and you're doing it specifically to get into college, then I highly recommend you do it the last 2 years of high school, because it's often what people, especially as a homeschooler, it's often when they give you placement tests at the college level, you may find that they're giving you placement tests in foreign language. And if you'd say took 2 years of Spanish because you had to when you were a freshman or sophomore, you may not remember enough when you're a junior and senior to test well. And as a homeschooler, to me, if you say you did really well in a language and then you can't test well on it, it kind of calls the validity of your whole transcript into question. So I highly recommend, if that's why you're doing it, then do it the last couple of years. But again, I think that there's plenty of reason to do it all the way through. When my kids were little, I just gave them a lot of various experiences with languages, a variety of languages when they were young. I made sure that I happen to be really good at languages, so I can pronounce things well in several languages. If you can't, you need to make use of oral tapes and series and little things on the internet and so forth, because what you don't want to do is teach them to pronounce things wrong. Right? So if you're no good at French pronunciation, then don't try to teach them French yourself. Learn it with them and use internet resources and tapes and so forth to have somebody who has a good pronunciation. When my kids were little, I always said we'd get together at the breakfast table, and if that was if I ever looked like a school, it was at the breakfast table, because we had them there anyway. We did a number of things, a little Bible study, and then we would do some other subject, and that was often a foreign language. So we did a little bit of German, a little bit of French, a little bit of Spanish, and so forth back in those days. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of focusing on Latin. I think a little bit of learning about Latin roots is very helpful, also Greek roots, but unless you're going into something scientific, to me, Latin is not a language that you speak anywhere these days, and so I'm not a huge fan of it. I understand why some people think it's foundational. Some people just want to do it because it was kind of in the classic curriculum, but you need to understand that back in those days, Europe was divided into so many small countries, and you went just a few miles. It's like going from Georgia to Alabama to Tennessee, and every time a new language was spoken. So they actually used Latin as the common language of the educated populace, and that's why they put so much stress on Latin. Obviously, though, it's foundational to any of the Romance languages. The Romance, it's not like romantic romance, it's like romance like from the Romans. And the Romance languages of French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian all have a lot of similarities, and they all do stem from Latin. English, on the other hand, is a combination of many things. The Romance languages, the influences of Latin, the influence of the Celtic nations, the influence of the Germanic languages, and so forth. So it's not as tied into it, but still, a little bit of Latin, especially knowledge of Latin roots and so forth, can really help develop your English vocabulary or any other vocabulary. So I'm not saying it's wrong to do it, but unless you have somebody that just wants to do it really badly, it's not my first choice, personally. Of course, you can disagree with me. Feel free to do that, all right? The importance of being motivated to learn a foreign language is really, really critical. So if you've got a kid who really wants to learn, say, Japanese, but you think it would be more practical for them to learn Spanish, by all means, let them learn Japanese, because the motivation is just so important. I was in a public school one time, substitute teaching in the high school level, and I was in a high level, I think it was like about a fourth year Spanish class, and talking to some of the people, and several of them were disgruntled because what they really wanted to do, they felt they had enough Spanish right now and they wanted to go learn Japanese, but the administration wouldn't let them. And one of the reasons is because nobody on the faculty spoke Japanese, so they didn't know how they would keep control over it. But really, is that the reason we want to learn, to keep control over it? No, to me, there are lots of things they could have done. They could have tied into some library resources or something like that, and given those kids the opportunity to learn Japanese. So at any rate, just make sure that your kids are, if they're really motivated to learn one language, don't make them learn a different one just because you think it's more practical for some reason. So when I do look for materials for learning, I think anytime that you really want to learn a foreign language, you're going to have a lot of different materials. You certainly need something that's oral. For that, personally, my favorite is the Pimsleur, Pimsleur language series, which many libraries have. They're expensive if you have to buy them for yourself, but a lot of public libraries have those. They're really set up for business people learning, that are international travelers learning, and they teach you to learn, I think, the language quicker than almost anything else that I know. As they get further up into the courses, by about the fourth level or so, you can start seeing that it's very specific to business people, and then it may or may not be what you're still looking for. There are, of course, a lot of other resources. One of the free resources a lot of people use is Duolingo, which is just duolingo.com. And I have found that is very, very good for building vocabulary, and just because a lot of kids like to do things, it's almost like playing to them to have it on the computer. I don't think it's very good in the long run for learning the language, and it definitely doesn't get into enough grammar depth for me. So if at some point, especially in the high school years, if you're going to be doing a foreign language seriously, you're also going to need some kind of a resource that lays out the grammar more specifically. And when you do, to me, again, it's fascinating. For example, when you're doing what's called conjugating verbs, and you have the singular and the plural and the first, second, third, and it's a little chart, and then you get to second person plural, and you see that English has a hole in the language. And that's why we make up regionally words like y'all and yous and yous guys and stuff like that to fill in this hole in the language. And I find personally that when you're starting to learn a foreign language a little more seriously, sometime after maybe the age of 12 or 13, it's a great time to also tie in some English grammar. As many of you know, I don't do a lot of grammar specific instruction when my kids are younger. I believe more in the importance of reading and being read to and working with them as an editor and so forth. But by the time they're 12 or 13 and doing another foreign language, it's a great time to start introducing those words like nouns and verbs and dangling participles and what have you, because you're in a situation where you can compare one to the other. All right. Now, again, there's lots of different materials, source materials you can look for. The public library has a lot, especially if you're looking at one of the more popular languages like Spanish. But in addition to that, if you are doing a language that anybody around you actually speaks, if you can watch TV shows, if you can get a book that's written, say, in Spanish and the same book written in English, you know, if you can go down the street and look at signs and so forth, if you can go into, for example, a Hispanic church and worship there sometime, there are so many things around, especially in Spanish in our area, that you can go out there and just be using it constantly. If this is something you're just going to study, you know, once a week for an hour, you're not going to learn that much, all right? You might learn a little. But when I was studying foreign language, one of the things I remember very strongly when I was a teenager, we had an alley in the back of our house with a basketball goal there, and I would sit there playing basketball for hours, just hours, and I wasn't even particularly into basketball. It was just something to do. And while I was doing it, I would essentially be studying whatever foreign language I was learning at the time. So at any rate, foreign language can be a tremendous addition to the curriculum, I think. I think that there's a lot of reasons to do it. I think a lot of people are afraid of it, especially if they're not good at it themselves. But there are so many resources today that if you just want to learn along with your children, I don't think you'll have very much of a problem. As many of you know, I have a YouTube channel now. If you want to ever see some of the things I have in that, it's it's youtube.com/relaxed homeschooler. And then I have a private Facebook group called Relaxed Homeschooling with Mary Hood. So if any of you are homeschoolers and you want to try to join that, there's a couple questions and then I'll let you write in. And we have a lot of various videos on that. For today, I think that's it. And I appreciate your watching. Thanks a lot.